Hello, everybody, and welcome to Books in Hindsight. I'm your host, author Matthew Hines. Today, unfortunately, we had a guest booked, but something rather unfortunate happened, and that guest is no longer going to appear on Books in Hindsight, ever. We're going to talk about that. But first, let's take care of some business. We'd like to thank all of our subscribers. We're getting so many of them. And we'd like to thank everybody who's leaving comments and sharing this podcast with their friends. We have a lot of great guests coming up, so it's going to be fantastic. So now, if you haven't considered a sponsorship on Patreon, please do so. And let's go we're not going to the phones because there's nobody to go to the phones to. So we'll be right back after this.
Welcome to Books in Hindsight, the only podcast where hindsight is always 2020. And we explore the great books, works, and ideas of the century. Now, here's your host, teacher, and author, Matthew Hines.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Books in Hindsight. Now, today I have to tell you that I am a little bit upset, and I'm going to try to be, mature, and not get angry about this, but I think it's something that is very important, and I think that this is something that you, as subscribers and listeners to this podcast, or any podcast, or anybody who's concerned about the freedom of the press, I think you need to know about this. Now, I'm not going to mention any names because I certainly don't want to give this person any more publicity because they certainly don't deserve any, even if it's bad. But I had a guest booked, and I had this guest booked a long time ago, like weeks ago. And I had found the guest on Twitter, and so we had corresponded via Twitter. And we had agreed that we were going to do the podcast a few weeks ago. And so right before we were about ready to do the podcast, she comes on and she says, "Oh, well, we have snow, so we don't have internet." And now she's telling me this on the internet. So I said, okay, we'll do the podcast later. And she said, okay. So we rescheduled the podcast until today. Now, let me give you the setting for today. That last night it started snowing after that lousy Super Bowl, which we might talk about in a little bit. But last night it started snowing, and it snowed all night, so that this morning there is a lot of snow on the ground. And now this person wants to do a podcast. She wanted to do it at 11 o'clock this morning, but then she changes and says, "Oh, I have to do it at 10. So I say, okay, no problem. And I tell my wife, I can't take you to work. You're going to have to walk through the snow, about half a mile. So no problem. And then right before the podcast, now we've been going back and forth for a long time. Right before the podcast, and if you're watching on YouTube, I'm going to put a little screenshot of her comments up, but she says that because she's looking at my timeline and she sees that I'm politically motivated, or that I have a political, I can't remember what she said, you can see it in the thing, but because I have some kind of political views, she refuses to do my podcast. And she waited until the very last minute to do this. Now, this is something I've never even heard of, but this is the rudest thing I've ever heard of in my life. This person just says that because I have political views, that she won't do the podcast. Well, first of all, she obviously has no, I don't want to say education, but she hasn't looked into the podcast, because if she had, she would see that I allow people from both sides of the spectrum onto Books in Hindsight. I just want to hear people's ideas. And I believe that you have to listen to people from the left and people from the right in order to come up with some version of the truth. So that is why I have always been open to allow every kind of person on Books in Hindsight. Now, this person who did this and was so, she made my wife, my poor wife, who comes from India, where they don't have like 6 inches of snow in Delhi. She made my poor wife walk to work half a mile. So it's not that she did something to me, it's that she did this to my wife. Now, why did she do this? Because she comes from a country that, I don't want to say anything, but my wife is from India, and I don't know if this is a racist thing. I don't know what it is, but I'm certainly not going to give this person any more credence than I already have, other than to say this, in case you don't get it, that if you don't appear on podcasts, especially like this one, where we have a very broad audience of conservatives, liberals, people who just like to read books, then you're never going to be heard. Nobody's going to know about your books. And I'm not putting any credence in your books because, quite frankly, I wasn't really excited about having you on the podcast in the first place, because I want that more like, these fluffy romance books are fine, but we've had some really amazing guests on this podcast, and then we have, fluffy romance books. So I really let you on just because I, saw you on Twitter, and you had sold some books right away. So I thought that was good. But the way that you have decided to treat me, a person you don't even know, because you say that I have the wrong political views, well, you're not going to go very far. And I hope that your publisher, anybody can look on Twitter, I guess, if they're really interested in finding out who this is. But I thought that your publisher is going to rethink what kind of person they have on their payroll. That, I don't know what your motivations are, but obviously you try to blacklist people for their political ideas. And I know you come from a country where you don't have freedom of speech, and you have a queen, and you don't have any real rights, and they're never going to let you have Brexit, and you're basically overrun by people that are not from your country. And so you have to take it out on somebody, I guess. But anyway, I am glad that this worked out like this, because first of all, I probably would not have liked you being on my podcast, because if you didn't have enough sense to research what the podcast is about, the kind of guests I have on the podcast, and you just went based on something you saw on my timeline. What did you see? Me and my Indian wife. Did you object to that? Anyway, I don't know what your deal is, but you would not have been a good fit for the podcast. And I really appreciate, in the long run, it was an inconvenience. And I get, as most people do, it's kind of upsetting, because I put a lot of work into, my authors. And I spent a lot of time even putting this author's books on my website and putting the author's information on not one, but my Heinessight.com website and my Books in Heinessight website. So this takes a long time to do, and I put all of her information and whatever, and then and this is the way that she turns around and treats me. So what kind of people do this stuff? Well, there's a thing called karma, and I'm not really that worried about it. I mean, it is kind of funny, and we'll just see what happens to her career, and we'll see what happens to Books in Heinessight. But I would put my money on Books in Heinessight. All right. Well, so what does that leave us with? Well, I'll tell you what it leaves us with. It leaves us with basically an hour podcast, and we don't have a guest to talk about any book. Now, I've heard people do podcasts where they don't have any guests at all, and they just sit there and talk about like women and relationships and whatever. So you know what? I want to talk about some of the things that really just piss me off. And I hate to say that, use that kind of terminology, but, in today's world where things are just so whatever, you have to say that to get that comedic shock value, So these are just some of the things that I think just really piss me off. And of course, I'm going to put at the top of that list rude people, like people that cut in front of you at the grocery line or whatever. So, who are the kinds of rude people that I don't like? Let's take this example. You ever drive down like a major highway and there's a lot of traffic and the traffic is all backed up and there's a lot of space in front, but not a lot of space around you? And why is that? Because the person who is in the passing lane is just doing the speed limit because they don't know that it's a passing lane. Now, where I live in Washington State, it is against the law in the entire state to drive in that lane unless you're passing. But we have people from who knows where, and they just think it's another lane. So they just play this game of let's block everybody in and keep the traffic slowed down and even further increase Seattle's traffic woes. That's just one thing. But the other thing that really even annoys me even more is that when you take a close look at that person driving in that lane, they are usually driving a Ford. Now, I'm not kidding. I don't have that much against Fords, but they're usually driving a Ford. So just check that out if you don't believe me. But that's one of the things that, just really kind of ticks me off. And that's not the only thing that ticks me off. There's a lot of things that tick me off, and other. What about work? Doesn't work. Don't you go to work and it's just a horrible job? Maybe it's not something that you wanted to do in your life, but you just ended up doing that because you needed money, and you said, well, this will be the way that I get to do the things that I want to do. But really, it's just the way that you ended up spending your life. Well, that's one thing that really stinks about work. But the other thing that stinks about work is when you don't have any. Now, throughout my life, I've had some really bad experiences in the jobs that I've had. So since we've got some time, I think I'm just going to tell you about some bad experiences I've had at certain jobs. Well, I come from basically almost like a logging community. Lots of people work in the woods, cutting trees. Well, I tried to do this for a little while, but guess what? They ended up giving me the axe. So it didn't work out that well. But It started even before that. When I was a kid, I used to work at the grocery store. I used to work at the grocery store bagging groceries, but I ended up getting sacked. So it was tough, even when I was a kid. But as I got older, I found out that jobs were even harder to keep, and so I took a job at this Les Schwab, but I got fired from that. I guess I was just always tired, so that was a job that didn't work out. So I wanted to stay in like the automotive world, so I got a job at this muffler shop, but I got fired from that because I was always exhausted. So it was really tough. I got a job at this spice plant, but they fired me after a real short time, said I wasn't cutting the mustard. So it was tough. And even beyond that, had another job, got a job selling shoes, but they ended up giving me the boot. So it was tough there. Taught for a while. Taught school, but they said I just didn't make the grade. So that was very tough, very tough. Got a job as an accountant, but things just didn't add up. So again, I lost that job. So yep, it was very very tough. In fact, I decided, well, I'm going to try something back in the outdoors. And I got a job as a wilderness guide, but they ended up telling me to take a hike. So it's pretty tough. And anyway, so those were some of the jobs that I had. And, that really, nothing makes you more angry than losing a job, right? But, there's other things that can make you angry too. And another thing, like there's a lot of these conspiracies out there, right? So there's this conspiracy theory about the moon. Maybe we went to the moon, maybe we didn't. And then there's a group of people who says that we saw UFOs on the moon when we went to the moon. So there's actually three groups of people we're talking about. There's people who say that we didn't go to the moon. There's people who say we went to the moon, but we didn't see UFOs. And there's people who say that we went to the moon and we did see UFOs. Now, my question is, if we didn't go to the moon, how did we see UFOs on the moon? So I just don't get that. It's, the conspiracy people, they're just, kind of out there sometimes. And for example, one time I joined this secret society, right? And it turns out it was so secret, after I paid the $500 admission fee, they wouldn't tell me where it was. So that was one of the things about secret societies. And, there's another thing that makes me angry is flying. I don't know if you guys do any flying or not, but flying has never been a real favorite pastime of mine. And I know that there's people that say they love flying, and people are pilots, and people talk about like this Mile High Club where, you go up and you do it at 5,000 feet or plus or whatever. Well, I'm kind of part of that Mile High Club, because every time I fly, I know I get screwed. So that's part of one of the things that I really hate. One of the things that pissed me off about people. Now, another thing that pisses me off about people that I have to tell you, since it's my podcast, is people say some really things that I don't get. Okay. So the first thing I don't get is remember back when they used to say, don't go there. Don't go there. Don't go there. Don't go where, right? Because I'm sitting here talking to you, okay? And they say, don't go there. And I'm thinking, well, was I going somewhere to begin with? I just don't get that. And then, that goes right into the basically, know what I'm saying? Know what I'm saying? Well, if I didn't know what you were saying, I'd stop you and ask you to repeat it. So no need to say, know what I'm saying, unless there is some need for constant verbal reinforcement as to the things that come out of your mouth. Okay, so two things: know what I'm saying and don't go there. Now, another thing that really I annoys me that people say is, and I find it completely insensitive, is I can't stand when people say safe travels, right? Safe travels. You're going on a journey. You're getting on a plane or maybe a ship or a car or something, but you are traveling and you could be putting yourself at risk somehow, right? Safe travels, not even a complete sentence, just safe travels. What does it even mean? I mean, it really just means I'm too lazy to string a few more words onto this phrase to make it a complete sentence and reassure you that I care about you during your trip. Safe travels just says, well, there's something else that's two words and it doesn't mean safe travels, but still two words. All right, so there's another thing that people say that really is not as is even more insensitive than safe travels, but is just also annoying, and that is when somebody dies, what do they say? They say, oh, sorry about your loss. Really? Sorry about my loss? I didn't lose a quarter. Somebody died. Don't you get that? Somebody died. I'm not going to see them again. I didn't lose money on the stock market. I didn't lose money at craps. I didn't have a loss. Somebody died that I'm never going to see again. And you can't even be specific as to reassure me in my grief so that I don't know if you're talking about my dead friend or if you're talking about something that I lost financially. So that's another thing that really annoys me. Now, the last thing that really annoys me is something that people say in order to be cool. Now, why do I say, I guess be cool? Because here's what. When I was a young lad, grew up in a small town, Washington State, and it was during the basically late 60s, although it was the early 80s where I lived, it was the late 60s. And the use of marijuana was common amongst my classmates. Now, what I would hear people say as they were on their way out to this coveted place called the Gully, which was a slight indentation covered with berry bushes where you could go down and be out of view, except for the smoke signals you were sending up from whatever it was you were smoking. So be that as it may, before people went out to the Gully, they would say one thing. They would say, or people would say to them that were not going out to the Gully, hey, have a good one. Have a good one. Have a good one. So I came to understand that have a good one meant have some good marijuana. Have a good doobie or smoke a good bowl. Have a good one. I never, ever thought that I would go around to grocery stores, movie theaters, hot dog vendors, whatever, bankers. Have a good one, they say. And I want to say, hey, do you know what that means? Am I going to go smoke a doobie right now? Well, that's what I mean. I mean, they don't even know what they're saying. Have a good one. Yeah, so those are some of the things that really annoy me. Now, there's another thing that really annoys me, and I guess I'm going to talk about it because it's the podcast. And it's not really a joke, although it is kind of a joke. And that is that it is cold outside, right? I mean, it started snowing last night, and there is so much snow outside, and there's people can't get to work. And I wonder why they never told anybody it was going to snow this much. I mean, they can predict the weather within 10 minutes. And they didn't tell people for weeks. It has not said anything about the snow. They could have warned people, go get food, go get water, fill up your car with gas, don't go to work this day, whatever. And they didn't do that. Why didn't they do that? Is the news so corporate owned that they just want you to go out there and wreck and die instead of warning you about what's going on? Well, they've brought a lot of people into Seattle that don't know what's going on here. They don't know about our climate. They don't know about our politics. They don't know that, there's not a lot of concern for their welfare unless they're a non-American. So that is one thing that really annoys me. But thank goodness, except for the fact that, this person basically forced my wife to have to walk to work. We're not dependent on having to drive on a highway littered with wrecked vehicles to get to work. So that's great, but it really does annoy me, and I guess it highlights the fact that I need you to sponsor me and Patreon and really help out this website financially so that I can get out of this place and go live in a place where I can have fulfillment and not be all agitated all the time because I'm living in this place where it's just so many people packed together. It's not even funny. It's just a complete nightmare. So that's, I guess, another thing that kind of annoys me is just how much everything is costing now, and there's just not much that we can do about it. So if you have any comments about that, or about the overcrowding situation in Seattle or your area, I'd sure like to hear them in the comments section. So if you're driving to work or driving from work and listening to this podcast, then you probably are just agreeing with me or thanking God that you're in a stretch where you're not jammed up and moving at turtle speed. So let's just talk about our future guests. We have an ex-military guy who was instrumental in the nuclear submarine program coming up on the next show. And after that, we have a comedian and podcaster and author. And we have another book editor as well as author coming up. And we have a few surprises in the works. But right now, things are looking really good at Books in Heinessight. So I know you guys are just dying to hear some more of my jokes. So before I finish, I'm just going to throw a couple of these at you. And if you don't like them, I guess you can just turn down the volume or switch to another podcast. But the next topic, I guess, would be about dating. Now, dating was never one of my strong points. In fact, I was the inspiration for blind dating. And in fact, I'm married now, but it wasn't easy. I actually entered a contest, which makes me a trophy husband. Unfortunately for my wife, she got last place. So that was part of my how I got married story. But before I got married, like I said, dating was not very easy. People would often ask me if I was what they call a pre-dator. I couldn't understand that, but every time I try to ask a girl, she'd say, "Are you a pre-dater?" And I would say, "Well," thinking that if I'm I'm going to go out on a date, then I guess the first part of that date would be the pre-date. So I always said yes to the question, are you a pre-dater? So that was probably not the best way to get girls. And I can tell you that if you think dating is tough now, just wait until you get married. And it's really tough. But I will tell you one piece of advice that I can give you is that I always told girls that I was a magician. And I did that so they wouldn't be surprised when I disappeared. So, yep, that's some of my dating advice, dating experiences, whatever. So you can see that, the day the podcast started off with a little bit of, kind of negativity because of this person, but we looked past that and we just told everybody what we are about at Books in Hindsight. And now we have a better understanding, I think, about what we want out of the podcast and what the podcast can do for you. And before I go, I just want people to understand that this podcast is for authors. This podcast is for authors to sell their books. This podcast is for authors to talk about their books. So if you don't want to be on my podcast, then that's great, because there are lots of authors that do want to be on this podcast, that do want to sell their books. So that's a choice you have to make. And I did not know, I never in the world suspected that it would be a politically motivated one. But if that is the case, then that is fine, because there are lots of people on here that are wise enough, smart enough, have the intellect enough, and the freedom enough to say ideas matter and not politics. So, for all of you people out there listening to this podcast, I want to thank you for listening, and I really want to thank you all for subscribing. It's a tough go out there. I can't tell you that this podcast is just, it's very, it's not easy to do. I don't have any help doing it. I do the scheduling, I do the website, I do everything. I do the uploading of editing, podcasting, and, the equipment, the lights, writing researching the topics and the guests. And there's just so much time it takes. So I really appreciate you guys that are listening and staying true to the podcast. It's going to go a long way, and we're going to have some fantastic authors on. So you can support us by buying books, by being a free thinker. But we would just want you to know that we really appreciate you spending the time on the podcast. And as you comment and subscribe and let us know your feelings, we know better to know what it is that you would like. So if there's guests that you would like to have on, or certain types of topics, certain types of books, leave it in the comments section. Send me an email at greatbooks@hindsight or greatbooks@hindsight.com, or just go to booksinhindsight.com and get on, send one of those contact forms, fill that out. But that's how we communicate, and that's how we keep the podcast going. So this has been, it's actually a blessing in disguise, because had it not been for this guest backing out for political reasons, then I wouldn't have had a chance to just sit and talk to you, my podcast guest, and give you a little bit of a history of the show, and tell you some of my jokes, and just kind of get to chat with you for a little bit, because I don't get to do that under the normal show's format. And should I lose another guest or whatever, unless there's something important to say, I don't think that I will do another one of these, because it just breaks too far from the format of the show. And when you tune into Books in Hindsight, you want to see an author. So this is Matthew Hines. I'm an author. I guess I can do a couple of plugs for my books. I just like to say that I had Troy Begich on he was my last guest. And one thing that I didn't say because I didn't think it was really cool to say it, but Nick Begich was the motivation, the inspiration for, let me see if I can get that in there, the RAINIER paradigm. He was the inspiration for the RAINIER paradigm. And the harp book, The Angels Don't Play This Harp, was the inspiration for this machine in the book that they're going to use to try to set off Mount Rainier and completely annihilate the population of the Pacific Northwest. Is it true or not? Well, I guess we're going to find out soon enough. So anyway, check out that podcast with Nick Begich, and check out, I have another channel called Deceptions of the Ages News. Check that out. That goes to basically advertise my book, Deceptions of the Ages. So check that channel out too. And please, I can't ask you enough to subscribe and to share this podcast. Check out my other books, Killing Time in Saudi Arabia, My Year in Oman, and Another Year in Oman. All right. Well, I hope that this has been something that you have listened to till the end of the podcast. Again, I do apologize for this guest backing out. There was nothing I could do, but I did want to continue to get my uploads, and we'll have a great guest on Thursday. We will have this Navy Admiral's name is Stephen Mays, and he is instrumental in the Navy's nuclear sub-program, and he is an author as well. So it's going to be a great podcast. But until then, I want to tell you all, again, I cannot thank you enough for watching, for listening. If you don't know this, we have a podcast. It's on Stitcher. It's on Spotify, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Google Play. I think that's it. And I think I said iTunes. So also on YouTube, if you're listening to the podcast somewhere else, you can watch the podcast on YouTube. All right. So that is it for our podcast for today. I really would like to hear what you guys are thinking. I'd really like to know what you want to listen to and the authors you would like to hear from. So please check out our websites, Books in Heinessight, heinessight.com, and hopefully you'll pick up a couple books. All right then. So for everybody out there, please keep an open mind. Please keep supporting each other. Please keep supporting artists. And please don't judge somebody or do something to somebody or be mean to somebody because of their political, if they're not doing something to you, why would you do something to them? So that's not how we roll at Books in Heinessight. And for this person that said that they wouldn't do the podcast because of I have political whatever views, then thank you for being honest. And we'll make sure that until you change your ideas, that your voice is not heard on Books in Heinessight. But for everybody else, you contact me. I want to see your books. I want to sell your books. I want people to know that you're out there so that they can keep on reading.
This has been Books in Heinessight with your host, Matthew Hines. Please join us for our next podcast and look for our archives on iTunes and go to theheinessight.com. That's HEINES site.com for great books by Matthew Hines and other great authors.